In this first Lesson 13 video, we're going to talk about your resume and strategies for it. And here's why. Your resume should be the anchor for your professional portfolio. On your resume, you include titles and blurbs and bullet points. Essentially, you tell people about yourself. In your portfolio, you have room to show people about yourself. You can show pieces of your writing process. You can tell stories about yourself as a professional. You can illustrate these stories with work you've done. In the second Lesson 13 video, we'll talk more specifically about thinking about your portfolio and refining and annotating pieces to include in your portfolio. And for one of the activities for this week, we'll each identify a portfolio of someone who works in a professional writing-related position, share the link to their portfolio, and talk a bit about the work the portfolio is doing for its creator, paying particular attention to the document design elements. Michigan State University's Career Services Network distributes a book list they produced a couple years ago titled 12 Essentials for Success. I share it as much and as often as I can. To research the publication, our Career Services staff interviewed dozens of hiring personnel and human resources staff who regularly interview and hire our students. Admittedly, the booklet is geared toward people leaving MSU with a bachelor's degree, but I think the key components are worth noting here. These are the 12 competencies that employers say they look for in new hires. They want to see evidence that applicants can act, be, serve, and perform in these ways. And they want to see evidence of these competencies in resumes and in portfolios. Okay, with those competencies as backdrop, I want to take us back in time. So first, we have Dennis Cooper's resume, circa 1974. Some of what we see here is fairly conventional. For instance, most people still include an education section on their resumes. However, these days we don't include birth date, height, weight, or health status. Dennis includes an educational highlight section, which is an interesting move, but really it's just a list of classes. It really doesn't tell us about his skills per se. For his experience, he includes the place of employment and his position, along with his responsibilities. If we keep scrolling, we can see this is fairly detailed. He's kept on his resume mail boy and stock boy positions. A shift with contemporary resumes is that you really only want to include relevant education and experience. Dennis also includes a good deal of information not typical in a contemporary resume, like his salary expectations and willingness to travel. This is a more recent resume and includes typical sections. We see experience. Further below, we see education. In the 1990s, it was typical to write complete sentences in a resume and to use the first-person pronoun I. These days, however, we see instead bullet points and phrases. So if Daniel were to revise this to look more contemporary, he might first rearrange this to make better use of space, and then, more importantly, include under, say, the first entry, automatic mech operator, developed projects and managed them through completion. Worked with engineers to install and change equipment. The third bullet might be designed machines to make them more efficient. And the fourth might be performed all phases of preventative maintenance. One more example, and this is a really recent one. I want to pause on this to pick on its design elements. The graphic box around the content is unnecessary and not at all typical for a resume. The clip art star does nothing for this person. The text is oddly spaced in place and the lists are poorly aligned. I wanted to look at these examples to argue that resumes are living documents, and they're living in two ways. First, you should always be adding to and updating your resume. Second, the conventions of resumes change over time. For instance, as we saw, it was typical in the 60s and 70s to include personal information and be really detailed about experience. In the 80s and 90s, the narrative form was used and objective statements were often included on resumes. Today, however, we don't include personal information. It's not only inappropriate, but can actually result in an applicant being excluded for consideration for a job. We prepare material in bullet points and phrases rather than sentences, and skills summary sections are much more common than objective statements. Today, typical resume categories include a header and contact info, and even though it seems odd to include a mailing address since hardly anyone actually physically mails job materials anymore, it's still conventional to include it. A set of competencies, usually labeled as skills, are included, as is some mention of educational background. Experience is a key section and includes relevant work, whether it was paid work, internship work, or volunteer professional work. You might include activities or community engagement. You might include honors and awards. You might consider including a career objective, especially if you're adding the resume to your online portfolio or posting it to a database that might have different audiences. If you're submitting a tailored version of your resume to apply for a specific job, you don't need and shouldn't have an objective statement. It's redundant, right? Your objective is to apply for and get the job to which you're applying. Unnecessary. You might include organizational affiliations, but generally only if you have some sort of position in the organization. For instance, you probably wouldn't include your church on your resume unless you serve as a promotions coordinator or outreach director or something like that. Typically, you don't want to include references or their information in your resume unless you're requested to do so. Don't include references available upon request either. Employers are going to assume that's the case. You don't need to tell them. And never include personal information or hobbies, even though it used to be conventional. Think back to the 1974 resume to do so. I want to talk briefly about two pieces of the resume that people I work with seem to struggle with the most. The first are skill summaries. Often what I'll see in a resume is a list like this: Adobe Photoshop, Microsoft Office Suite, conversational Spanish, communication interpersonal skills. Adobe Photoshop and Microsoft Office aren't skills, they're tools. This really tells me nothing about the skills this person has using the software in particular contexts to do particular types of work. Conversational Spanish is a skill for sure. Communication interpersonal skills might actually be skills, but this bullet doesn't tell me much. I often encourage people to create robust skills summaries prefaced by the type of skill. So for instance, this is a set of planning and organizational skills. Able to prioritize work, able to plan work activities, able to set goals and objectives, capable of effectively and efficiently planning time, capable of identifying and accessing needed materials, tools, resources, etc., able to work in an organized and efficient manner. Of course, what I would want to see in the resume and ideally in this person's portfolio is evidence that she actually has these skills. Another skill set might be related to writing. Might include things like proficient with proofreader's marks, the track changes feature in Microsoft Word, comfortable producing various written genres for various audiences, comfortable translating technical language for lay audiences, familiar with Chicago, APA, and MLA styles. And again, it'd be crucial for this person to offer evidence of these skills. Another key piece of the resume that I see people have trouble with is documenting experiences. I had a meeting a while back with one of the directors of our career services and placement offices here at MSU, and he mentioned meeting with a student to look over the student's resume. The student had served in a fairly competitive internship with the state capitol building, and the bullet points under his internship blurb on his resume read, greeted visitors, answered phones, made photocopies. A robot could do this work. So our career services rep got the student talking about his internship, fleshing out some details, explaining what a typical day was like. In the discussion, the student mentioned that he served as the first contact for visitors to the state capitol building. He greeted them, helped answer their questions, got them to the right legislative office, helped them sign up for tours and more. So they changed the bullet to read, served as public relations representative for state capitol and for state legislative offices. The student explained that when he was on the phone bank, he had to speak with a range of different people, but the most important task was to talk to constituents, help clarify their question or issue, and route their calls to the appropriate legislative office. This bullet became responded to constituent issues and routed them for resolution. And finally, the intern didn't just make photocopies. On a weekly basis, he had accessed 6 different major online news, policy, and legislative databases and pulled stories critical for the 3 representatives he was assigned to. Then he had to write brief abstracts and forward the pieces along to those legislators. So you can see how this bullet transformed. Does this first list tell potential employers about what the intern did? Yeah, but the second list does it so much better. This also illustrates a really important point. Talk to people about your resume. Email it to me. Share it with Professor Spano. Swap resumes with each other. I think at times people tend to devalue their experiences, or they're not very comfortable talking about how important those experiences are. Sometimes in conversation, others can help you really see and showcase your talents. An aspect we work on a lot here at MSU with student resumes and portfolios is transitioning academic language to professional language. So we might talk about rhetoric in our grad seminars, but if you're applying for a job and on your resume and in your cover letter you talk about your skills at rhetoric, a lot of people aren't necessarily going to know what you're talking about. So in your grad program, we might associate rhetoric the way Sid Dobrin and his colleagues do, a configuration of exigency, or that which compels us to write, the writer, the audience, and the document produced. We might anchor this to our purpose, per the goals of our readers or viewers, to inform, to define, to explain, propose, convince, and more. In this class, we anchored visual rhetoric specifically with the work of Aces and Lupton, who look back to Aristotle and situate rhetoric as a set of tools to aid people in being successful communicators, orally, textually, and visually. If we look to that great resource of the internet, Wikipedia, we see rhetoric defined similarly and involving 3 appeals we studied this semester: logos, pathos, and ethos, engaged by the rhetorical canons: invention, arrangement, style, memory, and delivery. All of this is fine and good, but unfortunately a lot of people see the term rhetoric and think it only serves to identify highfalutin, empty talk. So all of this is to articulate a job you have to do in your resume and in your portfolios, and that's translating the rhetorical skills and the competencies you have to professional competencies in work, in a way professionals in your field are going to understand them. So in academia, we might talk about rhetoric and the importance of cultural attention. Beyond academia, we might see employers and professionals using terms like communication, document design, and talking less about culture and more about audience and purpose and context. Rather than digital rhetoric, we might see things like web and social media strategy, digital communication, and more. And this is sometimes tricky work to do, but it's something you're going to have to practice, and something you'll see examples of people doing in the next lesson 13 video, where we look at specific people's portfolios. Okay, I want to wrap this up by talking a bit about resume management. This is a set of steps for working on your resume that I'd suggest if you aren't already doing it. First, prepare a core resume. This should be your master resume. It might have everything on it. It might be 3 or 4 or 5 or more pages long. Then, once you've identified a specific position to which you're applying, save the core resume with a new name and edit it down. Trim out the information that isn't relevant to that position. Visualize that process might look like this. Sometimes what I've seen in the past is people just have one resume and they save over it and save over it and save over it without saving it with different names and versions. You can lose a lot of your work when you do that. Having a core resume and then saving different iterations of it, I think, works much better. And further, I'd suggest you're even more deliberate and structured as you put your resume to use. I'd suggest creating a specific folder, maybe on the desktop of your computer. Inside that folder, consider creating a subfolder for each job to which you apply. Inside that folder, save everything related to that job application. You might PDF or screen capture the original job ad, the version of the resume you sent, the cover letter you sent, and more. And then you might also consider creating a spreadsheet so you can keep track of the jobs to which you've applied. You might, for instance, document the date the job was posted, the date you applied, the materials you sent, the title of the company or organization, and whether or not you heard back or followed up. This makes the job search process much more smooth. If you're moving laterally or you're only applying for 1 or 2 really specific jobs, you might not necessarily need to do this. But if you're juggling a handful of different applications, this is a great system. Before you head into Lesson 13, Video 2, you might want to check out a link and 3 documents I've linked from this page in our NYU classes site. The link is to a writing cover letters video I prepared for our undergraduate and master's students. And the advice is pretty flexible and should apply to all of us. As for the documents, one includes a resume brainstorming prompts, These are great if you don't have a resume, if you have a resume but haven't updated it in a while, or even if you have a pretty polished resume. I've also included a quick document that includes some content and design considerations. They're fairly general but really helpful. And finally, I've included a resume critique sheet. This is great to share with a friend or a colleague to prompt them if you ask them to review your resume. I found you get some pretty solid feedback using these questions.